Whenever I listen back to something that I do, it just makes me feel weird.
Hi, my lovely.
Hi.
Welcome to America's Got Talent.
There are moments in television history that stop time. Moments where an entire audience, thousands in the room and millions watching from home, collectively holds its breath, unsure of what they're witnessing. Courtney Hadwin created one of those moments. A 13-year-old girl from a tiny mining village in the north of England walked onto the America's Got Talent stage, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Quiet, nervous, barely making eye contact with the judges. And then she opened her mouth. What came out didn't belong to a child. It belonged to a woman who had lived through decades of heartbreak, loss, and raw, unfiltered experience. The voice was gritty, powerful, and ancient in a way that defied all logic. Simon Cowell, the man who has built a career out of being unmoved, sat frozen in his chair. Howie Mandel's hand flew to the golden buzzer almost instinctively. The crowd erupted, and within hours, the world was asking the same question: who is this girl? But here is the part of the story that nobody tells you when the confetti is still falling, and the judges are still cheering. Fame that arrives that fast, that loud, and that heavy doesn't always feel like a gift, especially when the person receiving it hasn't even learned how to drive yet. Courtney Hadwin's story is not simply a tale of talent discovered and dreams fulfilled. It is something far more complicated, far more human, and in many ways, far more heartbreaking. It is the story of what happens when an industry built for adults reaches down and pulls a child into its machinery before she is remotely ready for what comes next. To truly understand Courtney Hadwin's tragedy, you have to first understand where she came from, because where she came from is about as far removed from Hollywood as a place can possibly be. Heselden is a small former mining village situated near Hartlepool in County Durham, in the northeast of England. It is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where life moves at its own quiet pace, and where the idea of standing on a stage in front of tens of millions of people belongs firmly in the category of fantasy. Courtney was born there on July 6, 2004, the daughter of Paul and Anne-Marie Hadwin, and she grew up alongside her younger siblings in a household that was loving, grounded, and far from wealthy. Music found Courtney early, the way it tends to find people who are genuinely meant for it. She didn't discover singing through formal lessons or stage school ambitions. She discovered it the way most children discover the things that will define them, naturally, privately, and with a kind of quiet obsession that her family noticed long before anyone else did. By the time she was 9 or 10 years old, she was singing with a seriousness that went beyond childhood hobby territory. There was something in her voice that felt different, older, shaped by emotions she couldn't possibly have experienced yet. Her mother recognized it immediately. Her father, Paul, took on extra work, delivering pizzas, helping with fuel costs, simply so that Courtney could travel across the northeast of England to auditions, open mic nights, and singing lessons. She attended multiple local academies and schools of music, quietly building a foundation that most people never knew existed by the time they saw her on television. Her early competition appearances told their own story. In 2015, she reached the grand final of Teen Star UK in Newcastle with a rendition of Bob Dylan's Make You Feel My Love. The following year, she won Hartlepool's Performer of the Year award and opened for Sister Sledge at the South Tyneside Festival in front of more than 18,000 people. She appeared on The Voice Kids UK in 2017, tearing through a fiery version of Tina Turner's Nutbush City Limits and advancing all the way to the final. By any reasonable measure, she was already extraordinary. But none of that prepared anyone for what was coming. Because there is a difference between being extraordinary in the northeast of England and being extraordinary in front of the entire world. And Courtney was about to find out exactly what that difference felt like. The America's Got Talent audition happened in 2018 when Courtney was 13 years old. Show producers had reportedly been seeking international talent, and Courtney fit a profile that was hard to ignore. What they could not have fully anticipated was the magnitude of what was about to walk through those curtains. She stepped onto that enormous stage, looking genuinely overwhelmed. Small, quiet, dressed simply, eyes cast slightly downward. She looked exactly like what she was, a teenage girl from a small English village who had no business being on one of the biggest stages in American entertainment. The audience murmured sympathetically. The judges offered polite smiles. Simon Cowell, in his signature style, waited with neutral patience. And then the music began. Otis Redding's Hard to Handle. And Courtney Hadwin transformed. There is truly no other word for what happened in those next few minutes. The shy, nervous girl disappeared entirely, replaced by something wild and electric and absolutely commanding. Her voice tore through the studio with a grit and a power that made people physically react. Audience members jumped to their feet. Judges leaned forward, then back, stunned into confused delight. Howie Mandel reached for the golden buzzer almost before he consciously decided to, sending a cascade of gold confetti raining down onto a 13-year-old who had no idea her life was about to be unrecognizable. Simon Cowell, the man who famously never cries and rarely betrays genuine emotion, was visibly shaken. He told her directly, "You were this shy little thing when you came out. You sing, and you're like a lion." It was perhaps the most honest thing he said to her during their entire professional relationship. The audition video went viral within hours. Within days, it had accumulated views that stretched into the hundreds of millions. Headlines appeared across the globe. The British soul sensation, the 13-year-old who sang like a legend, the next Janis Joplin. Courtney advanced through the quarterfinals, the semifinals, and into the finals, delivering performance after performance that left audiences breathless. She ultimately placed 6th overall, a result that surprised many of her fans, but by that point, the industry had already decided what it wanted to do with her. Simon Cowell signed her to Psycho Music in partnership with Arista Records. The deal was announced with fanfare and excitement. Courtney described it as a dream come true. And standing outside of the machine, looking in, it genuinely appeared to be exactly that. But machines have gears. And gears have a way of grinding down the things they catch. At 14 years old, Courtney Hadwin signed a long-term recording and publishing contract with one of the most powerful label partnerships in the music industry. And almost immediately, the dream began to show its sharp edges. The problem was not malice. Nobody sat in a boardroom and decided to harm a child. The problem was something more insidious and more common in the entertainment industry, the complete and systematic failure to recognize that the person at the center of their investment was still a child, with a child's emotional needs, a child's developing identity, and a child's absolute right to figure out who she was before being told who she needed to become. The recording sessions started quickly. Co-writing sessions with teams of professional songwriters. Production meetings with industry managers. Studio time in Los Angeles that required transatlantic travel from a teenager who was still attending school and still living at home with her parents. A typical stretch of days could involve waking up in County Durham, flying across an ocean, sitting in a room full of adult executives who had very clear ideas about what her sound should be, and then flying home again, all while trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life. Courtney later reflected on this period with painful honesty. She described sitting in writing session after writing session where people around her were telling her what she should sound like and who she should be. She talked about recording songs that felt disconnected from anything she genuinely felt, music shaped by market research and industry trends rather than by the gritty, raw, emotionally honest instincts that had made her extraordinary in the first place. The comparisons to Janis Joplin, which had felt so thrilling and affirming in the beginning, became a kind of cage. A template she was expected to fit herself into rather than a compliment paid to her natural gifts. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that Courtney Hadwin's voice was never the product of calculation or strategy. It emerged from somewhere deeper and more genuine than that. The rasp, the power, the way she inhabited a song as though she were living inside it, none of that could be manufactured, and none of it was. It was simply who she was. And the industry, in its eagerness to monetize that authenticity, began systematically dismantling the very conditions that had produced it. Confidence eroded slowly. The joy of performing, which had been the whole reason she had started singing in the first place, began to feel less like liberation and more like obligation. She was carrying the weight of significant financial investment, contractual obligations, and the expectations of a global audience that had decided she was already a finished product rather than a developing artist. She was 14 years old. At some point, and nobody can point to a precise moment, Courtney Hadwin began to disappear from public view. It happened gradually, the way these things usually do. Social media posts became less frequent. Interviews dried up. The promotional momentum that had followed the AGT season slowed, then stalled, then stopped almost entirely. Fans noticed. Online communities began speculating. Some worried about her health. Others wondered whether there had been some falling out with the label, some professional dispute that had derailed her career before it truly began. The rumor mills worked overtime in the absence of official information, filling silence with invention the way they always do. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the rumors. Courtney was not ill. She had not been involved in any dramatic public falling out. What she was experiencing was something far quieter and far more common among young performers who are pushed through the industry before they are developmentally ready for it. She was burning out, losing herself, and slowly realizing that the path she was on was not her own. The mental and emotional toll of her early fame years was significant. She has spoken candidly in later interviews about the exhaustion she felt during that period, not just physical exhaustion, though the constant travel and the relentless schedule contributed to that as well, but a deeper kind of depletion. The exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that doesn't quite fit. The exhaustion of trying to be the person the industry needs you to be while privately feeling more confused about your own identity than ever. The exhaustion of being surrounded by adults, by suits, by contracts and deadlines and promotional schedules, while the part of you that is still a teenager just wants to go home, see your friends, and exist without pressure. She retreated. And in retreating, she did something that required genuine courage. She refused to keep performing a version of herself that felt false, even when the commercial pressure to do exactly that was enormous. Her relationship with Simon Cowell faded into professional distance. He had always been the executive who spotted her, the gatekeeper who signed her, not a mentor in any meaningful personal sense. His role in her story was real but limited. He identified extraordinary talent, created the conditions for it to be seen by the world, and then handed that talent over to an industry apparatus that was never designed with her well-being in mind. Whatever feelings Courtney had about that dynamic, she kept largely private. But the silence between them spoke clearly enough. The years between her AGT fame and her reemergence as an independent artist were not wasted years, even though they looked quiet from the outside. They were years of rebuilding, painful, slow, unglamorous work that happens in private and rarely gets written about because it lacks the drama of either spectacular rise or spectacular collapse. Courtney found her way back to music by stripping away everything that had been added to it. No label mandates. No co-writing sessions with strangers who didn't know her. No industry molds to fit herself into. Just her voice, her thoughts, and eventually a collaborator who understood what she was trying to do. That collaborator was Kevin Bowe, a Grammy-winning producer with a long history of working with artists who operate outside the mainstream. Artists like Etta James and Joe Cocker, musicians whose power came from the same place Courtney's did. Raw emotion, authenticity, and an absolute refusal to sand down the edges that made them interesting. Working with Bowe, Courtney began writing and recording songs that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely like her. The music that emerged from this period was markedly different from what the label had been steering her toward. Songs like Monsters, You Only Love Me When I Lie, Breakable, and That Girl Don't Live Here were confessional and angry and deeply personal. They dealt with themes of vulnerability, identity, the experience of being shaped by outside expectations, and the hard work of reclaiming yourself afterward. They were not radio-friendly in the conventional sense. They were something better than that. They were honest. The response from listeners and critics who encountered this new work was striking. Reviewers described her sound as raw and fearless. You Only Love Me When I Lie was called a blues soul anthem of genuine emotional power, the kind of song that could only have been written by someone who had actually lived through what it describes. A stripped-down, microphone-free performance video she shared online left viewers stunned, not by spectacle, but by the rare and unmistakable quality of real feeling. She was becoming, slowly and on her own terms, the artist she had always had the potential to be. Not the next Janis Joplin. That comparison, while flattering, had always been someone else's story mapped onto her. Something original, something that belonged entirely to Courtney Hadwin. Courtney Hadwin's story is personal, but is also institutional. And to treat it as purely personal, as the story of one individual's difficult journey through early fame,